Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old Fourth Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
Heading into the weekend, and I don't know about you guys, we finally have fall weather here in North Georgia. Pretty excited about that. We've spent the last, week and a half doing, not just on this show, but throughout the podcast sphere, cable television news, pundits alike, all lining up to diagnose what went wrong with the 2024 election cycle, for the Harris-Walz campaign, for Democrats in general. I think when you look down ballot, the Senate losses were, somewhat predictable. The map was going to always be a bit of a hard one for Democrats to come away feeling good about. House races seem to be at a bit of a standstill, but obviously we're looking at an unpopular man who ran for president, winning the popular vote, obviously the Electoral College with it. And I pointed this out yesterday and have said this for a couple of days on social media. We came within 350,000 roughly votes in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania from winning the presidency and losing the popular vote. We almost flipped the script on 2016. Oh, and oh my gosh, if you think the election deniers of 2020 made a lot of noise, had the man won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College, whoo, that would have been something. We would have constant, persistent investigations. They had an army of attorneys lined up for fights in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and in Michigan. Oh, and here in Georgia as well. I'm starting to put together this picture of damned if you do, damned if you don't with Democrats. I've talked a lot over the last couple of days about what I believe is a radicalization of the white male voter and how Donald Trump seems to have benefited from that. I'm also going to dive a little bit into a sense of disaffectiveness amongst black voters, notably and probably statistically black men, and how Democrats have to walk this tightrope. I talk with folks all the time on social media. One in particular, I've had him on the show before, Alan Holmes. He is a local Atlanta resident and activist, and he has been on the show before. We talked about reparations, I believe, at great lengths, because he very much believes that it's long overdue this country have a conversation on reparations. And I don't disagree with him. I also understand the political realities. It's never going to fly. I mean, I say never. It's not going to fly politically. This is one of those issues where I kind of wish Joe Biden had all along decided he was going to be a one-term president so that we could have that conversation without him worrying about electoral consequences. Obviously, anything Joe Biden did during his presidency would have dogged Kamala Harris anyway, so maybe that's a moot point. Also, coming out of a pandemic and dealing with an economic recovery, money's tight, folks are worried about deficit spending, yada, yada, yada. It probably just wouldn't have been this would not have been the precise moment to talk about it. And obviously, I try to explain with anyone who talks about any issue like that, whether it's reparations, Gaza, Israel, you have a swing to one side on popularity on it, but you also have an issue of degradation on the other side, which is what takes me back and forth to the, was voter apathy with black male voters a problem this election cycle? And was the radicalization of some white male voters also a problem? And how do you address both of them? It's very hard for me, in my mind, to address one without negatively affecting the other. Being a Democrat, running as a Democrat, especially on a national scale, where you are trying to coordinate and collaborate with a mosaic of people, literally a mosaic of people, is hard. To be pro-Gaza, to many, is deemed to be anti-Israel or anti-Jewish. To be pro-Israel is deemed to be anti-Gaza. and Biden-Harris has had to walk a tightrope for quite a while. It is political. Hear me out. I'm very much against genocide, and I very much loathe Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel going balls to the walls militarily in Gaza without regard for, it appears to me, and it appears to most, I say most, many, to have no regard whatsoever for civilian populace, the population in Gaza. It just, tens of thousands have died. It's not very surgical at all. I also understand that while Biden-Harris hasn't done much to rein in Benjamin Netanyahu, I also understand that there's not a whole lot that they can do. I also understand that it's political suicide to say, that's it, you've crossed the line, no more allowance for you, young man. Because you lose, you may get cheers from folks who have been protesting college campuses and quietly and peacefully protesting for an end to this war, but you may also lose as much, if not more, votes on the other side of the argument. It's very hard to run as a Democrat in this country when you have polarizing issues like that. Here's something I found interesting, by the way. On my own personal Facebook page, I shared one of my show's posts where I talked about broaching this conversation about the radicalization of white men in America. And I shared that on my personal Facebook page just to let my friends know, hey, listen, this is a conversation I'm going to start having on my show. Feel free to wander in. Feel free to tune in. Yada. It's self-promotion, right? I have a neighbor who I infrequently see in the hallways of the condo building I live in, and his name is David, and he seems like a nice guy. I get the sense he's very much a libertarian. I also know he's a white male. Something of a libertarian. He kind of he's one of those that it drives me nuts when, both sides suck. Okay. So I already know where I'm starting. I don't mean this in a dismissive way. When I hear both sides suck, I immediately think this is someone who doesn't follow politics in a fine-tooth manner. David wandered into that conversation. Actually, he's the only one that's wandered in on the conversation. It had a lot of likes and a lot of folks who wandered over to my page to chime. He wanted to wander in on my personal page and offer some of his thoughts on this. And we came down to a conversation, some misrepresentation of policies and positions. This is what happens. And I talk to Democrats about this all the time. Democrats have to do a better job of messaging and refute the caricaturization. Sometimes that means showing up in places that aren't necessarily safe Democratic areas to eviscerate the caricaturization. But we talked, we went back and forth a good bit yesterday and came down to a beef that he had with student loan repayment. I firmly believe that is one reason why we've seen a spike in white voter support for Donald Trump and against initially Joe Biden and eventually Kamala Harris. Student loan repayment complaints are pretty much on brand. He brought it up, so I said this to him. They're pretty much on brand with regards to white male radicalization, and I'm glad he brought it up. Never mind the spike in tuition, the predatory lending that ensnares 18-year-olds who've been brainwashed into believing a college education is in their best financial interests and that the jobs they're seeking afterwards are necessary, and in STEM, of course, they are. That student loan forgiveness has disproportionately benefited students of color and women of color has something to do with that, I believe. I wasn't calling him a racist. And I don't think he's offended. He hasn't said he is anyway. Last I checked, we are still friends. So he didn't unfriend me. Maybe he just hasn't had a chance to respond. Or maybe he doesn't have a response. I don't know. I continue, though. The need for student loan assistance for people of color, after all, usually stems from a lack of ability to pay for tuition outright, which would be easier had there been any generational wealth to draw from. That's easiest to accrue in this country through home ownership, which is, of course, my wheelhouse. I'm a residential real estate agent. I'm a realtor here in Atlanta, Georgia. And well, we need to understand our nation's history better to understand why that created a predicament for college students of color. So it was in this back and forth with my neighbor David that I presented an opinion piece that Janice Gassam-Asari wrote for Forbes. She's a keynote speaker, educator, workshop facilitator, writer, and consultant. She founded an award-winning consultancy called BWG Business Solutions, where they provide guidance and education for workplaces looking to foster more equitable environments. She's also written 3 award-winning best-selling books, Decentering Whiteness in the Workplace, The Pink Elephant, and Dirty Diversity, and was named LinkedIn's top voices in racial equity. Janice Gassam-Asari writes, non-whites, for example, were prohibited from owning homes. Home ownership is the primary driver of wealth. That's exactly what I said to David. There are still a number of cases of racism in the home appraisal process. The homes of black borrowers are underappraised, sometimes by hundreds of thousands of dollars. Having an understanding of American history will allow each of us to recognize the ways that systemic racism has and still continues to impact marginalized communities. For American Indian and Alaska Native communities, the generational impacts of systemic racism have led to negative health outcomes, such as lower life expectancies and health disparities, as well as a plethora of other issues. Attempts to silence conversations about systemic racism have come in the form of critical race theory bans and the diversity training prohibition of 2020. Racist dog whistles have been used throughout history to denigrate those in greater need, while excusing the unearned benefits and privileges that many continue to profit from. Hundreds of years of historical marginalization has yet to be rectified. Introducing bills aimed at remedying these inequities should be supported. What's ironic in me even presenting that piece in the conversation I was having with a white male neighbor of mine is that I can also listen to the last few words of what she wrote there and say, no, I agree 1,000%. It's also political suicide. That's the tightrope Democrats have to walk. Yes, hundreds of years of historical marginalization has yet to be rectified. She's right. And introducing bills aimed at remedying those inequities would be political suicide. That is the tightrope the Democrats have to walk. Because, yes, in doing so, you are addressing something that is an inequity that has been long building and needs to be dealt with. You also have the negative effect outside of the affected community. And this, to me, is kind of a microcosm of the American political ecosystem, environment, since the Civil Rights Acts were signed into law. When I hear wasteful spending, government waste, yada, yada, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there isn't government waste. I would never do that. I mean, there's a reason we joke about the $45,000 toilet seat, in the Pentagon, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there's not wasteful spending. I would never do that. I would say, however, that when you hear conversations about government waste in a political lens, a lot of it has to do with social wellness programs. And yes, obviously we spent a ton of money to try and eliminate poverty in this country. And by the way, we've done a really good job of it since FDR. Specifically with our senior population, regardless of race, right? The senior population doesn't face crippling bankruptcy and starvation and hunger the way they did prior to the Social Security Act, which isn't a catch-all, save-all, but still, it's there. Between Social Security and Medicare, our senior population is in way better shape than they were in the 1930s. But when it comes to dealing with marginalization and poverty, we've sort of tread water. We've made inroads and we've lost ground, et cetera. A lot of that is political. A lot of that is racial and political. And I tell conservatives this all the time. If you want to be a fiscal conservative, you would want these programs to work so that we can move on from having these problems in the first place. And we can't because of decades of sabotage. That's right. That's what I'll call it. Sabotage. Willful political sabotage. Underfunding, unfunding, understaffing, unstaffing, which we'll deal with for another 4 years, sabotages those efforts. They are setbacks. Marginalized people will get the bootstraps conversation. Sorry, that's what they'll get. Irrespective of the decades and even centuries of marginalization that still have effects on society today, as Mrs. Asari wrote in her piece there in Forbes, which I'll include the show notes at ronshowatl.com. Actually, give me a second here. Got to take a quick break. The Ron Show, America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn or wherever you podcast. You can follow The Ron Show on your preferred social media platforms. Now on Blue Sky at Ron Show ATL. Twitter X, yeah, still there. Although after their new terms of service and data sharing and AI and whatnot, that is the last Twitter X account that I have because I don't want my personal info. I'm sorry. And also Elon and yada, yada, yada. Facebook, Instagram threads at Ron Show ATL. And again, Blue Sky as well. Ezra Klein was on Pod Save America here recently, and I want to let you hear something he had to say about voter support and a swing to the right, even in major cities.
I come from outside Los Angeles. I lived in San Francisco until 18 months ago, and I live in New York City. The thing that surprised me least about the election was the sharp red shift in these big cities. Because if you just talk to anybody who lives in them, they are furious. And this idea that like, oh no, the economy is actually good or crime is actually down, or this is all just Fox News, like shut the fuck up with that. Like talk to some people who live near you. The rage I just hear from people in New York, this is partially Greg Abbott busing huge amounts of migrants here, but that does mean, by the way, there are enough migrants that Greg Abbott could bus actual human bodies to New York City. And it was a big enough problem that New York City was not able to effectively deal with it, right? It does show that what was going on the border was much worse. I think the Democrats were letting themselves accept for all the cruelty of what Abbott did there. That was not like an ad campaign. Those were like actual people who had come into the country who were overwhelming border states. The sense of disorder rising, right? Not just crime, but homeless encampments, trash on the streets, people jumping turnstiles in subways, crazy people on the streets. You just talk to people and they're mad about it. They feel it's different than it used to be. I mean, in San Francisco, like the fury is overwhelming. And you see that it's not just the presidential level. London Breed, the SF mayor, just lost re-election. In Oakland, they recalled the mayor. A bunch of the progressive DAs across the country were recalled or beaten in re-election campaigns. If Eric Adams has a lot of problems, but if he were obviously on the ballot, he would almost certainly, it seems to me, lose. You have to be able to govern well. People don't follow politics, but they live in the place they live. They see if prices have gone way up. And a bunch of economists telling them, no, don't worry about the price of everything. At least for some people, and maybe net, a slight majority of people, real wages have modestly outpaced inflation is like not going to do it. Because people feel when they get a raise, that's them. And when prices are going up, that's you, the government.
Which to me just kind of comes back to a little bit of a disconnect that I think many people have. Prices going up is not the government. That's big business. That is capitalism. That's what we want. We want free market capitalism in this country, right? That's what the majority of this country professes to want. We have spent for the last 4 decades eviscerating government, limiting the size and scope of government, the flex of government. We've weakened the bicep. There are no levers in the Oval Office to address prices. None. I mean, Kamala Harris ran on an offer to work federally at price gouging. She didn't win. He spoke about the migrant crisis and busing migrants from the Texas border to blue cities and the effectiveness that may have had on voters. And again, Democrats didn't create that crisis either. Did Joe Biden underplay the problem at the southern border? That's a conversation you could have. I'm open to having that conversation, but I would also push back and say, well, 2 months after he was sworn into office, he spoke before a joint session of Congress and said, send me a bill to address this. They didn't send him a bill to address it. He kept waiting for Congress to act. on immigration, and they didn't. They control the purse. They control the budget. He can't put Border Patrol agents at the southern border on a whim. He can't invest in the judicial system at the southern border to process the growing number of immigrants coming here on a whim. He needs Congress to do that. They didn't do it. We came really close just this past spring, 3+ years into his presidency, and who derailed it? Donald Trump. Now he gets to try and handle it himself, and he'll do his own brand of doing it, which is, getting tough and erecting a wall, which doesn't solve the problems that send people here. To which the GOP would just say, well, that's not my problem. No, but it's a problem of our making. And whenever we decide to grow up as a country and realize that and address that, maybe we'll have some success. I know that that's something that the Biden-Harris administration were working on, root causation of migration in Central and South America. But as we've learned, that is a hard sell to the American voter. We will pick up that conversation after this break. Thank you for listening on America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn or wherever you podcast.
Call or text The Ron Show anytime at 404-919-2725. The Ron Show on America One Radio.
So I was talking before we had to take a quick break there that Ezra Klein brought up some of the ways that Democrats had been unable to have a frank conversation with the American voter about the realities of certain aspects of where we are in this country. The migrant crisis, for example. The American voter, and listen, if you've listened to me go on and on about, anything on this show for the last 2 years or any portion of that, you know that I've had this conversation. The American voter doesn't want to hear the truth. They don't want to hear the hard facts. Here's the hard fact, especially when it comes to immigration, when it comes to deficit spending, when it comes to racial inequities and addressing them, which have effects on crime. A large part of this country has had it good for a really long time, and there comes a price to pay for it. No politician is going to win a federal seat in the House or Senate or the White House telling the American people that. But it's true. And you can't say that to all of America because the marginalized voter is going to be like, bullshit. This existence is tough. And they're not wrong. But what did we learn in the aftermath of the election? What did we hear? Mississippi is the poorest state in the country, and the average income of Mississippi is better than Great Britain. We don't want to hear that. It's been tough here for us. We've had it tough because we've had it better. The inflation talk. It's a hard sell to the American voter. Yeah, you know what? Inflation has been a kick to the nards. It's been tough. It's affected our pocketbooks. First of all, we're on the other side of that. Inflation, 2.4% last month, 2.6% this month. That is normal. You don't want negative inflation. You don't want deflation because then you're in a recession or a depression. So voting your way thinking that, we need prices back to where they were in 2020, that ain't happening. It's not going to happen. Have you paid attention to capitalism? It's not going to happen. Your wages have kept pace. And not for everybody, I get that. But that's also not Joe Biden's fault, Kamala Harris's fault. I would kind of sardonically or cynically say, well, pull yourself up with the bootstraps. Why didn't you go to your boss and ask for a raise? I get that. And for folks who are self-employed, it's an even harder sell. But if you are in business and your costs go up, then your price has got to go up too, right? I mean, that's business, that's capitalism. But what I was getting to was the American people don't want to hear, and it's a hard sell. I've tried to say this for months now. It's a hard sell. Yeah, inflation was bad here, but it was worse everywhere else. We actually softened the blow. It wasn't as bad as it could have been. Can't put that on a bumper sticker. Can't put that, in a slogan behind your candidate. Freedom, freedom. Could have been worse. It's hard to sell that, right? But those are facts. It's also hard to tell the American voter, hey, listen, I realize this immigration thing really makes you uncomfortable. I get that. And it looks like there is like this open door, and it's not really true, open door policy at the southern border, and folks are just coming in and they're stealing our Social Security and our Medicare. Also not true. They're contributing. If they're doing anything with the Social Security and Medicare, they're contributing and not getting anything back. The term is gracias. Thank you for your contribution that you'll never get back. Whatever. But there are the effects on housing quantity for rent in particular. We do see local services that they also pay into, by the way. Again, gracias. Being stretched in the immediacy because of a growth in population. But this is also a bill, a tab coming to the table, y'all. It is. It's a tab coming to the American table. And we're like, we're not paying that. I didn't order that. You did. You sort of did. You just don't know it. Between the, 4 or 5 dozen military incursions since the early 1900s in Central and South America by our own people, economic sanctions on countries like Venezuela and Haiti and Cuba, Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador. Punishing nations' economies has an impact on the people that live in the nations. Negative impact. Climate change, all of these things that have made NAFTA. There's an aversion for NAFTA. Listen, NAFTA was an unpopular, deal because it sent blue-collar jobs to Central and South America. You want people to have jobs there so they don't come here, right? Okay. But it comes at the expense of those who want those blue-collar jobs here in the United States, too. You see what I'm saying? I mean, you have a positive effect on one thing, and on the other side of the pendulum, you've got the negative effect. It's the theme of the day. But getting rid of NAFTA or undoing NAFTA or deciding to take another tack with NAFTA, eliminating jobs or bringing jobs home from those countries, well, that has an impact on that country. And again, climate change. This is a big deal because climate change and even with Haiti, we can't call earthquakes climate change, right? But earthquakes are very real, have an impact on that country to devastating effects for decades now. But climate change, thanks to first world living, and we are a first world country, we are the first world country, have had impacts on other parts of the world even worse than what we're dealing with. I mean, Hurricane Helene was sort of the canary in the coal mine, right? Hello, you're trying to move away from the coast and get away from hurricane effects? Okay, fine. Move to the North Carolina. Oh, yeah. There's your sign. And if it impacts you in the North Carolina mountains, imagine how it impacts folks who live in Central America. Let me turn this from immigration to racial disparity and inequalities. This is a hard sell to the white voter. Obviously. Pitching reparations is a non-starter. Pitching student loan debt forgiveness, which isn't even overtly targeted at just minority college students. It just disproportionately benefits minority and female minority college students. And a large percentage of conservative voters who are majority white oppose student loan debt forgiveness, despite the fact that most folks who have that kind of student loan debt have already paid the principal on the loan, and the interest just keeps compounding in ridiculous amounts for decades to come. Never mind any of that. They don't want to hear that. They want to, well, that's just not fair. Oh, you want to talk fairness? No, they don't want to talk fairness. That's the point. They don't understand. That's the tab that's come to the table for something they didn't order, but they definitely enjoyed. The response is usually along the lines of, well, I wasn't here for slavery. I wasn't here for Jim Crow. That's not my fault. Nobody's blaming. That's the thing. Nobody's blaming anybody. We just don't want to even have a conversation about recognizing facts, history that led to current facts and scenarios and situations that need to be addressed, regardless of who is or was back then to blame. And as long as we keep having that kind of, well, I didn't cause that. Don't make me pay, y'all. Then the problem's never going to get solved. Do you want to solve the problem? Do you want this to be a United States of America, a colorblind society where every child, regardless of color, creed, background, income, has an opportunity to succeed without barriers? I mean, it's a pipe dream until we address, here's that word again, or that term again, root causation. Not just of migration from Central and South America, but that is how you solve that. Building a wall, being tough, being an asshole to people who come here isn't going to stop people from needing to flee their home country to go somewhere. It's like diverting floodwater. You can put up that little barrier all you want. You can put up the barrier all the way to your driveway. Guess where the water's going? To your driveway. You avoided the house, but it's going to your driveway. I work in real estate, right? I see people all the time. I tour houses where people have put up gutters, and the gutter flushes out down to the bottom of the house and sort of away from the foundation, right onto the driveway. Okay, you've saved the house. Foundation won't be dealing with that water from rain, but your driveway is cracked as shit and discombobulated and uneven, and well, but you saved your house. Gosh, y'all, is it any wonder why one side wants to rewrite or suppress history as much as they do? I mean, it's just so patently obvious. If we pretend there isn't a problem, or there isn't a reason or history that led to these problems, we can just capitalize on the problems while not solving the problems and continue to stay in power, perpetuate the problems, rinse, lather, repeat. And because it's impossible to address any of the issues that we know as a society we have to deal with, well, I say we know. Do we know? Enough of us know to make the noise anyway that we have these issues that need to be addressed. The problem is being unable to address them is actually costing the party trying to address them support from the folks they're trying to address those issues on behalf of. Bernard Fraga is a professor of political science at Emory University, author of The Turnout Gap. He issued a tweet real early this morning, shortly before 6 a.m. Georgia is the first state to release full vote history for 2024. As a share of the citizen voting age population, turnout rates went up for all groups compared to 2020, except Black Georgians, he writes. Which, to me, I find kind of funny. I really would have thought that voter turnout for just about everybody was going to be down just a tick because we made it so easy to vote in 2020. In 2020, white voter turnout, 72.1%. It went up to 74%. Hispanic voter turnout, 38.6% in 2020. It went up to 42.3%. That is a huge jump. Asian Pacific Islanders, 64.3% turnout, 64.5%. Slightly up, but still up. African American voter turnout, November 2020, 60.2%. It went down by 1.9%. They're the only subset that you see that decrease in. And you have this sentiment, I'm seeing it all over social media, that the Harrison Walz team, Georgia Democrats, were downplaying polling about losing black voters, telling us they were going to come home. Friend of the show, he's been on the show. Hope to have him on again soon. Alan Holmes, he tweets, some of us knew there were unaddressed black voter problems. He even went so far as to say something regarding the Ezra Klein clip that I played earlier, where he says, I'll only focus on the migrant crisis. Democratic mayors have handled this very poorly. First of all, they didn't ask for it. It came to their doorstep because governors in Texas and Florida sent folks, human people, pawns to their cities. Allen tweets, they've neglected their black American constituents for years, created animosity that's built up, and are facing the fire after dedicating so much city money to the migrant crisis. I'm like, the migrant crisis that they didn't ask for. They didn't budget for it. How do you... So I decided to respond to him. And again, I'm pretty much off of Twitter X except for the show account. But for conversations like this, where I said, taking tribalistic attitudes feeds the GOP's divide and conquer strategy. We, Americans, are the driving reason people flee their home countries and wind up here. And until we address that, the crisis will continue. No wall or, be an asshole to scare them all off mindset's going to change that. His response. Hone in on this now. His response. This actually has nothing to do with Republicans. No, Alan, it has everything to do with Republicans. He says it's benign neglect. It's a fact that many cities run completely by Democrats have neglected U.S. citizens, black Americans specifically, he says, for years. It's inexcusable, and folks will speak on it. To which I said, Alan, we live in the same city, and its elected leadership is majority black, and is or usually has been for decades. I'd hedge a bet that's the case in most of America's largest cities, not in Texas or Florida. The issues are systemic between gerrymandering, neutering representation at the state and federal level, which affects what state and federal dollars goes to these cities, to decades of state-level immobility on addressing the ills these cities have had to address almost on their own from the effects of white flight the last 60 to 70 years due to gerrymandered-in conservatives gumming up any efforts to address said ills. I liken this to Dems should be punished stuff to a kid being mad at their battered mom because she didn't do better at standing up to her abusive husband. There's no way to set Republicans aside on this. No way. In fact, we're actually helping them by having this kind of infighting conversation while absolving the Republican Party of their complicity in these problems existing and continuing to exist. This is The Ron Show. Back after this. As I wind down the show in this conversation that we're having, where I'm just kind of focusing in on the infighting that really kind of needs to come to a stop within the Democratic Party, I'm reminded that this is the same playbook. This is the same tactic that Vladimir Putin and Russia, and by the way, well before Vlad Putin, the Soviet Union, this was their tactic to divide us with disinformation, misinformation, and divisive rhetoric to weaken us. That's exactly what the Soviet Union and now Russia has done to us societally, and the GOP is taking it and utilizing that same strategy to divide Democrats. Don't let it work. Understand it, acknowledge it, recognize it, and say, okay, not going to do that. First, I would caution. This was not, I think, just a statement, a rebuke of the Democratic Party. This was a global phenomenon. The economy and inflation caused incumbents to hemorrhage. So let's first set that out there. But I want you to hear a conversation that I listened to yesterday on NPR featuring three Democratic strategists who were asked what happened and where does the party go from here. Among them were Adrian Shropshire, Paul Begala, who everybody knows, and Waleed Shahid, who really caught my attention with a lot that he had to say. This in particular.
My parents and many people, pretty much everyone in my family has voted Democrat every single year since they've been citizens. My family is Pakistani American, Muslim American. And this was the first year that people in my family voted for Trump. People entertained the idea of voting for Trump. And it was largely about two things. One was the war in Gaza. Second thing was they didn't feel like their number one issue, which was the cost of living, that Democrats had done anything for them. And so what they heard from the Democratic Party is vote for us, we'll protect democracy. But they don't really believe that democracy is working for them. And in that vacuum, unfortunately, strongman authoritarians like Donald Trump who say, I alone will fix everything, it kind of works because the current system that the Democrats were defending, the status quo that they were defending, just wasn't the mood of the country and wasn't the mood of a lot of Democratic voters.
It's not necessarily a rebuke of the Democratic Party or its values. It's a rebuke of the fact that, we're talking about protecting democracy, and a lot of marginalized voters are like, hasn't been working for us anyway. What are we rallying to protect? I mean, the truth is, our democracy is so freaking flawed anyway, we can't really even call it a democracy. Remember, we're told we live in a representative republic. It's not really a democracy. So a lot of folks heard that argument about protecting democracy and thought it was kind of hollow. Well, it's not exactly working for us. Gerrymandering, a capped house, electoral college, yada, yada, yada. It doesn't exactly work for us. And as he alluded to, the kitchen table economic issues. Something that my guest from, what day was this? Tuesday? Dr. Jack Zabluck, he said, well, Democrats really didn't explain inflation and the cost of goods, et cetera, and so on in a simplistic way. Yeah, we came out of a pandemic. There were supply chain problems. It was a big global mess, and we're finally through it now. Unemployment stayed under 5%. It's now, under 4.5%. Inflation now finally corralled, and now you want to change course? That should have been the argument. I'm going to go back to the NPR conversation I was listening to yesterday. Ari Shapiro, the host, had this question to lob. And here's why I came away so enamored with Waleed Shahid, because I think he delivers the message that Democrats have to take, pivot, and walk with going forward.
What do you do when the Republicans say on day one, we are going to address policy towards transgender people, for example?
I think that Democrats need a both-and approach around delivering real economic results to working class Americans and not shying away from real societal changes that are happening around us that we can't just pivot away from. We need to humanize trans Americans. We need to contextualize trans Americans. We need to do the same thing that we did in the struggle for gay rights, which is fight these battles and persuade not just in election season, but in the years before election season. And I think we lost to the oldest playbook in human history, which is divide and conquer. And one place I would push back on, Paul, is that Democrats also need we're too conflict averse. We're trying to be everything to everyone. We need to create villains. Part of the thing is the Democrats have gotten too close to the boardrooms of Uber and Facebook and Wall Street, some of the grocery companies, and we need to take on those villains. Otherwise, the Republicans will create and manufacture villains every single time.
Let me let this conversation run a little bit longer, though, because it actually kind of comes back to what I've been talking about trying to placate everybody and dealing with some of the long-term systemic issues that this country has yet to pay the tab for.
The last time Democrats were in the wilderness for 12 years, Ronald Reagan for 8 years, followed by George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton got back into power by saying, it's the economy, stupid, we're going to tack to the center. Is the same answer going to work for Democrats 4 years from now, 2 years from now?
No.
Yes.
Go for
We got a no, a yes, and Adrian?
No. I don't think that we're in a fundamentally different world than we were then. Again, I would say to Waleed's point, like the country has changed, right? Not just in terms of its complexion. And we have to address the issues that are fundamentally dividing Americans. And that is not just the economy. We can't, as a country, we are incapable, unable, unwilling to address the sort of central issues that have created our inability to get to a more perfect union. And that is absolutely racism. The Democratic Party absolutely cannot run away from that. And I know that for myself and my community, we've been dealing with this for a very long time. I think when we look at Black folks right now, the sort of general sentiment is like, okay, here we are again.
That part, exactly. Back to Waleed Shahid, who I thought had the point of the conversation.
The thing I'm sitting with is like, we do need to be able to speak to Americans to the mood that they're in. And the mood that they're in today is one of change, one of wanting to understand the cultural changes that are happening in the country around race and gender and sexuality. And also their pocketbooks. Their pocketbooks are empty. Things cost too much. And so we need to do all of the things. I think what I'm frustrated with is there's been all this talk this past week about how Democrats need to abandon the woke part of their party, and very little talk about abandoning the billionaires who are part of their party, who are harming our ability to speak in terms of class warriors and not just cultural warriors. And
I don't know. The Republicans had Elon Musk and they managed to do it.
But they are running a campaign based on, again, the oldest playbook, which is Elon Musk is somehow a victim of American democracy rather than a success story of how the economy and democracy works for people like him. And so I feel so ashamed that the Democrats were unprepared for the onslaught of what was going to be attacks on the lines of migration, the border, transgender Americans, when we knew this was coming years ago, and yet we didn't develop a strategy to explain to the American people what this was designed to do, which was to help elect Republicans and people like Elon Musk and get them more power.
It goes without saying that Waleed Shahid got a follow from me on Blue Sky, which I'm on now, at Ron Show ATL. That is going to do it for the Ron Show. We have another weekend upon us to regroup, reflect, and unwind a little bit. Give yourself that grace, okay? Back here Monday, 9 to 10 a.m., 5 to 6 p.m. on America One Radio, 11 p.m. to midnight at Progressive Voices via TuneIn or wherever you podcast. Show notes at RonShowATL.com.